Nobody wants to say it out loud yet, but the truth is getting harder to ignore with every passing week. The WNBA didn't just miss an opportunity. It didn't just fumble momentum. It actively dismantled the biggest moment women's basketball has ever had, piece by piece, while pretending everything was fine. What makes this story uncomfortable isn't that Caitlin Clark brought attention to the league. It's that her arrival exposed how fragile the entire system really was. For a brief moment, it looked like the league had finally crossed over. Arenas were full. Television numbers jumped. Social media was flooded with highlights, debates, and people who had never watched a single WNBA game suddenly arguing like lifelong fans. But underneath all of that noise, something wasn't lining up. The excitement felt borrowed. Temporary. Almost like it belonged to one person, not the league itself. And that distinction matters more than anyone inside the WNBA wanted to admit. Because there's a massive difference between building a product people love and riding the wave of a once-in-a-generation star without actually fixing what's broken underneath. The league celebrated the moment as proof of success. The players treated it like validation. The leadership acted like the hard part was over. It wasn't. The hard part hadn't even started yet. Because when attention shows up faster than structure, when popularity grows quicker than planning, and when ego replaces patience, what looks like a breakthrough can quietly turn into the beginning of a collapse. And the Caitlin Clark era didn't end because fans lost interest. It ended because the people in charge didn't understand what they were holding. And to see how this all started going wrong, you have to understand one uncomfortable reality the league never wanted to say publicly. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. From the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto a professional court, everything changed in a way the WNBA had never experienced before. Viewership surged. Ticket sales spiked. Games that used to struggle for relevance suddenly became must-watch events. Networks that barely promoted the league before were suddenly pushing highlights everywhere. And for the first time in a long time, the WNBA wasn't fighting for attention, it was commanding it. But here's the part most people glossed over. This wasn't a slow, organic rise. This wasn't years of steady growth finally paying off. This was an explosion, and explosions don't happen without a trigger. Caitlin Clark was that trigger. She wasn't just another star entering the league. She was a cultural moment. A player casual fans recognized instantly. A name that cut through the noise of an oversaturated sports world. People didn't tune in because they suddenly became experts on WNBA rosters. They tuned in because they wanted to see her. They wanted to see if the hype was real. They wanted to watch history in real time. And once they did, many stayed longer than expected. Not forever. Not automatically. But long enough to give the league something it had never truly had before, leverage. That leverage came in the form of packed arenas where empty seats used to be the norm. It showed up in highlight clips going viral outside of basketball circles. It appeared in debates on sports shows that hadn't mentioned the WNBA in years. And maybe most importantly, it brought in a wave of casual fans, the most valuable and fragile audience any league can have. Casual fans don't owe loyalty. They don't stick around out of tradition. They don't care about internal politics or historical context. They follow moments, stars, and stories. And Caitlin Clark gave them all three at once. But instead of recognizing that reality, the league made a fatal assumption. It assumed those fans were now WNBA fans for life. They weren't. They were Caitlin Clark fans first. And the distinction between those two things would end up mattering more than anyone wanted to admit. Because when a league mistakes a single star's gravitational pull for institutional strength, it starts making decisions based on confidence instead of caution. It begins acting like the audience is permanent, not temporary. And it forgets that attention can disappear just as fast as it arrived. What should have been treated like a fragile window became a victory lap. Players began speaking as if the league had finally made it. Negotiations shifted in tone. Expectations changed overnight. And instead of focusing on converting new viewers into long-term supporters, the conversation turned inward, toward entitlement, recognition, and demands that didn't match the foundation beneath them. This was the moment when the opportunity was still alive, when the league still had control, when smart, disciplined leadership could have locked in growth, stabilized the future, and built something sustainable around the momentum Caitlin Clark created. But that's not what happened. Because while fans were filling seats and tuning in out of curiosity, something else was happening quietly behind closed doors. And that's where the real damage began. And what came next would put everything, including the 2026 season, at risk. The shift didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single press conference or headline where everything went wrong. Instead, it crept in quietly, disguised as confidence. As arenas filled and cameras showed excited crowds, the tone inside the league changed. What started as cautious optimism quickly turned into something more dangerous: certainty. The attention Caitlin Clark brought wasn't treated like a temporary window. It was treated like a permanent upgrade. Players spoke as if the league had finally broken through for good. Leadership talked about growth as if it were guaranteed. And somewhere along the way, gratitude was replaced with expectation. The league didn't ask, "How do we keep these fans?" It asked, "How much more can we demand now?" That question alone revealed the problem. Instead of locking in long-term stability, the WNBA began operating as if it had already earned it. Salaries became a central talking point. Comparisons to men's leagues started showing up everywhere. Social media narratives shifted from celebration to confrontation. The underlying message was clear. This moment wasn't just proof of growth, it was leverage. But leverage only works if the foundation underneath it can support the weight. The league had never been profitable. That hadn't changed. It was still dependent on outside support to survive. The sudden spike in interest didn't erase years of financial reality. It didn't magically transform casual viewers into die-hard fans. And it certainly didn't guarantee that the spotlight would stay once the novelty wore off. Yet decisions were being made as if all of that was irrelevant. Players began speaking openly about being undervalued, even as viewership numbers made it clear that interest was tied overwhelmingly to one name. Negotiations hardened. The tone became combative. And rather than using the Caitlin Clark moment as a bridge to something sustainable, it was treated like proof that sustainability had already arrived. This is where arrogance becomes expensive. Because confidence without structure doesn't build strength, it builds blind spots. And the league developed several of them all at once. It underestimated how fragile new fan interest really was. It overestimated how much leverage players actually had. And it ignored the basic reality that attention doesn't equal loyalty. Casual fans don't follow labor disputes. They don't pick sides in internal power struggles. They don't stay invested when the story stops being fun. And the WNBA was slowly shifting the narrative away from basketball and toward entitlement, conflict, and demands that felt disconnected from what fans were actually tuning in to see. This wasn't growth management. This was momentum mismanagement. Instead of moving carefully, the league rushed. Instead of consolidating gains, it tried to cash them in early. And instead of building around the one thing that was clearly working, it acted as if success had become automatic. That misread would come back to haunt them. Because the louder the demands became, the more pressure they put on a system that was never designed to carry that weight. And the moment the conversation turned from "how do we grow this?" to "pay us like we're already there," the cracks started to show. The public didn't see it yet. Fans were still showing up. The headlines still sounded optimistic. But beneath the surface, the league had already stepped onto a path that led somewhere dangerous. And that path led straight into negotiations that would put the entire future of the WNBA on the line. Because once confidence turns into confrontation, there's no easy way back. And what happened next didn't just slow the momentum, it put the 2026 season in serious jeopardy. By the time contract negotiations took center stage, the tone had already shifted beyond recovery. This wasn't a routine labor discussion anymore. It was a standoff. And the stakes were far higher than most fans realized at the time. Because buried inside these negotiations was a threat that could undo everything the league had just gained. The possibility that there wouldn't even be a 2026 WNBA season. Collective bargaining agreements aren't exciting for casual fans. Most people tune them out. But this one mattered, because it revealed how far reality and expectation had drifted apart. On one side was a league still operating at a loss, still dependent on outside financial support, still trying to convert attention into stability. On the other side were players demanding salaries and guarantees that assumed the league was already thriving. The gap between those two positions wasn't small. It was massive. Offers were made that would have represented unprecedented compensation in the history of the league. 7-figure contracts for a season that lasts only a few months. Improved travel conditions. Better benefits. Structural upgrades that players had been asking for over years. From the league's perspective, this was a major step forward, a risky one, but a sign of commitment. The response wasn't negotiation. It was rejection. Publicly, the message was defiant. There would be no compromise, no gradual transition, no patience. If demands weren't met, the players were willing to let everything stop. An entire season wiped out, not as a last resort, but as leverage. This is where the miscalculation became impossible to ignore. Threatening a work stoppage in a fragile league isn't a power move, it's a gamble. Unlike established sports organizations with decades of embedded loyalty, the WNBA doesn't have a fan base that waits around indefinitely. Interest isn't generational. It's conditional. And the surge brought by Caitlin Clark made that even more obvious. Fans weren't invested in the league's internal politics. They weren't emotionally tied to collective bargaining outcomes. They were there for the basketball, for the moment, for the story unfolding on the court. And the idea of canceling a season over negotiations sent a clear signal. The league was willing to sacrifice momentum to prove a point. That's not how sustainable businesses operate. Instead of treating negotiations as a delicate balancing act, one that required realism, humility, and long-term thinking, they became a battleground for ego. Demands escalated, rhetoric hardened, and the possibility of number 2026 season went from unthinkable to very real. What made this even more dangerous was the timing. The league had just experienced its highest levels of attention ever. Casual fans were watching closely. Sponsors were evaluating whether the investment made sense. Media coverage was expanding cautiously. And in the middle of all that, the message being broadcast was chaos. Stability matters more than ambition at moments like this. And stability was nowhere to be found. But the most alarming part wasn't even the demands themselves. It was who was steering them. Because the people leading these negotiations weren't neutral. They weren't detached. And they didn't just represent the players' interests. They had interests of their own. And once that became clear, the situation crossed from risky into reckless. Because what kind of league allows individuals tied directly to a competing organization to shape its future? That question is where everything starts to unravel. And it leads straight into the conflict of interest that most fans still don't fully understand. At first, most fans didn't notice it. The headlines focused on money, fairness, and empowerment. The conversation stayed emotional, not structural. But buried beneath the noise was a detail so explosive that it should have stopped negotiations in their tracks. Instead, it was quietly ignored. And that silence changed everything. The individuals leading the charge in these negotiations weren't just star players. They weren't just representatives advocating for better conditions. They were also deeply connected to something else, a separate basketball venture that didn't rely on the WNBA at all. A competing league, operating outside the WNBA's ecosystem, with its own leadership, its own financial interests, and its own vision for the future. That alone should have raised immediate alarms. Because negotiations aren't just about what you demand. They're about what outcome you're willing to accept. And when the people leading those talks have alternatives, real alternatives, their incentives change. Suddenly, risking the collapse of the league isn't unthinkable. It's leverage. This is the part most fans missed. The leadership at the center of the CBA standoff wasn't fighting solely to improve the WNBA. They were fighting from a position where walking away didn't cost them everything. And that distinction matters more than any salary number ever could. In any business, conflicts of interest like this are treated as deal breakers. They poison trust. They distort decision-making. And they shift priorities away from sustainability and toward power. But in this case, it was framed as empowerment, as players finally taking control, as progress. In reality, it was chaos disguised as confidence. Think about what that means for the league. Negotiations weren't just about improving conditions within the WNBA. They were being shaped by individuals with a direct stake in an alternative future, one where the league they were negotiating with didn't have to survive at all. That changes everything, because pressure tactics stop being about compromise and start being about domination. And yet, the majority of players went along with it. Not because they had analyzed the long-term consequences, not because they fully understood the risks, but because strong voices were telling them this was the moment to stand firm, to demand everything, to refuse moderation. And when emotion replaces strategy, crowds follow the loudest voices, not the wisest ones. What made this even more dangerous was how it played publicly. The narrative wasn't about conflict of interest. It wasn't about sustainability. It was about leadership failures, respect, and being heard. And those are powerful talking points, especially in a league already sensitive to issues of recognition and value. But none of that changes the reality of the situation. You cannot negotiate the future of a league while actively building an alternative to it without creating a massive credibility problem. You cannot threaten to shut down a season when walking away doesn't actually hurt you. And you cannot expect fans to trust a process that feels increasingly detached from the sport they came to watch. The moment this conflict became clear, the negotiations stopped being about money. They became about control, about whose vision would survive, and whether the WNBA was being strengthened or slowly undermined from within. And the most unsettling part? Almost nobody inside the league seemed willing to confront it head-on. Because once you acknowledge a conflict like this, you have to admit that the league's future isn't just being negotiated, it's being gambled. And the chips on the table aren't just salaries or benefits. They're the league itself. And as this power struggle intensified, something else began to take over the conversation. Something even more dangerous than conflict of interest. Emotion. Because when feelings replace facts, reality doesn't disappear, it waits. And it always collects its debt. And that's exactly what happened next. At some point, the conversation stopped being about what the league could realistically support and became entirely about what players felt they deserved. And once that shift happened, reality was no longer part of the negotiation. It was treated like an inconvenience, something outdated, something that needed to be overridden by confidence and collective belief. This is where the situation became genuinely dangerous. Every professional sports league lives and dies by one simple rule: revenue dictates sustainability. It's not emotional. It's not political. It's not personal. If money coming in doesn't cover money going out, the system collapses. That rule doesn't disappear just because attention spikes or narratives change. And yet, inside the WNBA, it was being treated as optional. The surge in viewership brought by Caitlin Clark created the illusion that the league had crossed some invisible threshold, that it had finally arrived. But viewership spikes don't instantly translate into long-term revenue. Sponsors wait. Networks analyze trends. Casual fans drift unless they're converted. And none of that happens overnight. Still, the demands being made assumed permanence. They assumed growth without fluctuation. They assumed loyalty without proof. And most critically, they assumed that the league's financial losses were irrelevant. They weren't. The WNBA was still operating at a deficit, still reliant on support, still trying to find a model that worked. None of that had changed just because arenas were fuller for one season. But the rhetoric surrounding negotiations made it sound like the league was suddenly overflowing with cash and simply refusing to share it. That perception didn't just distort expectations, it poisoned the conversation. Because once you frame a negotiation as a moral issue instead of a structural one, compromise becomes impossible. Any attempt to discuss sustainability gets reframed as disrespect. Any reminder of financial limits becomes an insult. And any push for patience gets interpreted as oppression. That's when facts stop mattering. Instead of asking how to build something that lasts, the focus shifted to winning the moment, to extracting maximum concessions while the spotlight was hot, to treating economic caution as weakness. And the louder those sentiments became, the further negotiations drifted from anything resembling strategy. This wasn't about whether players deserved better conditions. That debate had already been won. The issue was scale and timing, and neither was being respected. A league can grow into higher salaries. It cannot demand them into existence. But inside the WNBA, that distinction was being ignored. Demands were framed as overdue justice, as corrections for past wrongs. And while that language resonated emotionally, it collapsed the moment it encountered numbers. Because no amount of belief can turn losses into profit. No amount of confidence can sustain a business that spends more than it earns. And no amount of empowerment rhetoric can replace a functioning economic model. The problem wasn't that players wanted more. The problem was that the league was being pushed to promise what it couldn't sustain. And once those promises are made, there's no graceful way to undo them. This is the trap that emotion sets. It convinces people that consequences are negotiable, that reality will adjust, that someone else will absorb the cost. And in this case, the assumption was clear. The league or its supporters would just keep covering the gap. But that assumption was already wearing thin. And as negotiations dragged on, something else began to shift, Not behind closed doors, but in public. The tone changed. The messaging hardened. And fans who had just arrived out of curiosity started feeling like they weren't welcome unless they fully agreed. That's when momentum really started slipping. Because attention can survive mismanagement for a while, but it cannot survive hostility. And the next phase of this collapse didn't happen in boardrooms or negotiation sessions. It happened in the court of public opinion. The backlash didn't arrive all at once. There wasn't a single moment where fans collectively decided to turn away. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, as the tone around the league began to change. What was once excitement started feeling tense. What was once curiosity turned into discomfort. And for casual fans, that shift mattered more than anyone inside the WNBA seemed to realize. New fans don't show up looking for arguments. They show up for entertainment, stars, and stories they can enjoy without homework. But instead of welcoming that audience, the league's public messaging became increasingly confrontational. Viewers who tuned in because of Caitlin Clark suddenly found themselves surrounded by debates they didn't ask to be part of. Social media feeds filled with hostility. Interviews grew sharper. Public comments started framing criticism as betrayal. And instead of pulling fans closer, the messaging created distance. Casual viewers don't want to be lectured. They don't want to be told what they owe a league. And they don't want to feel guilty for enjoying a sport on their own terms. This was a critical mistake. Because every league needs casual fans to survive. They are the bridge between niche relevance and mainstream stability. They are the people who buy tickets on impulse, tune in without deep loyalty, and slowly become invested over time. But they are also the first to leave when the experience stops being fun. And that's exactly what started happening. Rather than centering the conversation around basketball, competition, and growth, the narrative shifted toward grievances, demands, and internal conflict. Caitlin Clark, the very reason many fans were watching, became a flashpoint instead of a centerpiece. Instead of rallying around the moment she created, the discourse often treated her popularity as a problem to be managed rather than an asset to be embraced. To fans, that felt backward. They weren't tuning in to watch power struggles. They weren't invested in negotiation tactics. They weren't interested in being told that their excitement was misguided or incomplete. They just wanted to watch basketball and enjoy the rise of a star. But the league didn't meet them where they were. Instead, the messaging began to suggest that attention alone wasn't enough. That appreciation had to come with alignment. That enjoying Caitlin Clark without fully endorsing every narrative surrounding the league was somehow insufficient. And that kind of pressure doesn't build loyalty, it creates resentment. For a league still fighting for relevance, that's a dangerous position to take. Because casual fans don't argue. They disengage. They don't announce their exit. They simply stop tuning in. And once they're gone, they rarely come back unless something extraordinary pulls them in again. The irony is that the WNBA had that extraordinary pull in its hands. It had momentum. It had visibility. It had a star who brought in people who had never cared before. But instead of nurturing that fragile relationship, it strained it. And as public perception shifted, something else became more noticeable. The silence from the person at the center of it all. Caitlin Clark wasn't speaking out. She wasn't taking sides. She wasn't redirecting the conversation. And for a league built on narrative and emotion, that absence of clarity created its own set of consequences. Because when a moment demands leadership and none appears, people start drawing their own conclusions. And that silence would soon become just as influential as any statement. Caitlin Clark never asked to be the face of the league. She never volunteered to be the voice of reason. And she certainly didn't sign up to referee a power struggle that had been building long before she arrived. But moments like this don't wait for consent. They choose their central figure whether that person wants the role or not. And once the league's momentum began to wobble, all eyes naturally turned to her. Fans weren't expecting a speech. They weren't demanding confrontation. What they wanted was clarity. A signal. Something that acknowledged what everyone could feel, but no one seemed willing to address. Instead, there was silence. And in a moment this volatile, silence doesn't stay neutral for long. At first, it was easy to understand. Caitlin Clark was new. She was focused on basketball. Staying out of controversy made sense. Any statement she made would be dissected, twisted, and weaponized. So she stayed quiet. She played. She let others talk. But as negotiations escalated, narratives hardened, and fans began drifting away, that quiet started to mean something else. To casual viewers, her silence felt like distance. Not rejection, but detachment. They had followed her into the league. They had defended her. They had filled arenas to watch her play. And as the league around her spiraled into conflict, they waited for a sign that she saw what they were seeing. It never came. This is where perception starts to matter more than intention. Leadership doesn't always look like loud declarations. Sometimes it's a single sentence that grounds the conversation. Sometimes it's a reminder of reality when emotions take over. And Caitlin Clark had the credibility to do that in a way no one else did. She was the reason the spotlight existed. She was the bridge between old fans and new ones. But she never crossed it. That choice, intentional or not, shifted the dynamic. Fans began asking uncomfortable questions. If the league was risking everything, why wasn't the person benefiting most from its survival speaking up? If the moment was being wasted, why wasn't the star who created it urging caution? Those questions didn't turn into anger. They turned into disappointment. And disappointment is far more dangerous. Because disappointment doesn't argue. It disengages. The league didn't just lose momentum because of negotiations or messaging. It lost something more fragile, emotional investment. And Caitlin Clark's silence became part of that loss, not because she caused it, but because she didn't interrupt it. This wasn't about blame. It was about gravity. When you're the center of attention, everything you do or don't do carries weight. And as fans slowly pulled back, they weren't just reacting to the league's chaos. They were reacting to the absence of a stabilizing voice. By the time that absence became noticeable, the damage was already spreading. Because once fans start questioning why they should care, the story changes. The magic fades. The novelty wears off. And what replaced it wasn't excitement. It was skepticism. Which leads to the harshest reality check of all, the one delivered not by opinions, but by numbers. And those numbers would expose just how fragile the moment really was. Illusions survive on belief. Reality survives on numbers. And when the numbers finally came in, they did something no argument ever could. They stripped the moment down to what it really was. For months, it was easy to believe that women's basketball had finally crossed into a new era. That interest had stabilized. That the audience was now permanent. That leverage had shifted decisively in favor of the players. But once the spotlight moved even slightly away from Caitlin Clark, the truth became impossible to ignore. Viewership didn't just dip. It collapsed. Games without her saw dramatic drop-offs. Matchups featuring supposed stars struggled to hold attention. And events that were framed as proof of independence, proof that the league no longer needed a singular draw, landed with a thud. The audience that was supposed to be there for the league simply wasn't showing up. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't media bias. It wasn't some hidden conspiracy. It was market behavior. Fans had followed a star, not a structure. The most revealing moment came when alternative platforms tried to prove that the audience would migrate no matter where the players went. The assumption was simple. If people cared about the athletes, they'd follow them anywhere. New league, new format, same interest. That assumption was wrong. Without the WNBA's infrastructure, marketing, and cultural positioning, the audience evaporated. Viewership numbers were so low they'd barely registered in the broader sports landscape. What was meant to be a statement of independence became a warning sign. This is the part that shattered the leverage myth. Because leverage isn't about confidence or unity. It's about alternatives. And the ratings made one thing painfully clear: the alternative didn't work. Fans weren't loyal to platforms. They weren't loyal to collectives. They weren't loyal to slogans about empowerment. They were loyal to moments. Caitlin Clark created one of those moments. The league didn't replace it. And when the moment passed, the audience didn't stick around out of principle. They moved on. That's how casual fans behave. They don't stay out of obligation. They stay because something keeps pulling them back. And when that pull disappears, so do they. What made this especially damaging was timing. These numbers didn't come out after years of decline. They surfaced right when negotiations were hardening, right when threats of a work stoppage were being floated, right when players were assuming maximum leverage. Instead, the data suggested the opposite. It showed that the league's power position was weaker than ever, that the audience was narrower than expected, and that the moment everyone thought could be exploited had already begun slipping away. Yet the demands didn't adjust. Negotiations continued as if the audience was waiting patiently, as if the fans would return whenever the league decided to resume. as if momentum could be paused and restarted at will. But momentum doesn't work that way. Once it's broken, it's gone. The ratings didn't just expose fragility. They exposed overconfidence. They revealed that the league had mistaken attention for attachment and hype for habit. And by the time that realization hit, the opportunity that Caitlin Clark created was already fading into memory. Which brings us to the most painful part of this entire story. Because this wasn't inevitable. This moment didn't have to be wasted. And when you lay all the pieces out, the timing, the choices, the arrogance, the misreads, it becomes clear that the WNBA didn't lose its golden opportunity. It gave it away. When people look back on this era, they'll probably argue about details. About who was right. About who should have compromised. About whether the demands were justified or the criticism was fair. But all of that misses the larger point. Because the most devastating part of this story isn't the disagreement. It's the timing. Opportunities like this don't come around often. In fact, they almost never come around at all. The WNBA didn't just get attention, it got relevance. It got curiosity from people who had spent years ignoring it. It got airtime, debate, and cultural presence in a sports world that rarely slows down long enough to care about anything new. And all of that happened because one player cracked through the ceiling in a way no one else had before. That moment should have been treated like glass. Fragile, precious, temporary. Instead, it was treated like proof of permanence. Rather than locking in fans, the league pushed them away. Rather than stabilizing operations, it escalated conflict. Rather than unifying around the moment, it fractured internally. Every decision seemed to assume there would be another chance, another star, another surge. There might not be. Because fans don't wait forever. Casual audiences don't return just because a league decides it's ready again. Once they move on, they're gone. And the sports landscape is ruthless when it comes to attention. There's always something else competing for it. What makes this moment especially painful is how avoidable it was. No one was asking the league to choose between growth and fairness. No one was demanding silence or submission. All that was required was restraint, strategy, and understanding that momentum is something you protect before you monetize. But that understanding never took hold. Instead, the league allowed jealousy to creep into the conversation. It allowed narratives to form that treated popularity as a threat instead of a gift. It let power struggles overshadow performance. And it failed to recognize that Caitlin Clark wasn't just a star. She was a bridge to a future that still needed to be built. And bridges only work if you cross them. By the time the league realized what was happening, the moment had already cooled. The debates had replaced the joy. The conflict had replaced the excitement. And the fans who once tuned in just to see what the hype was about had quietly disappeared. Not angry. Not outraged. Just uninterested. That's the real loss here. Not money. Not negotiations. Not public perception battles. Interest. And once interest dies, everything else follows. Which leads to the uncomfortable question no one inside the league seems ready to answer. What happens now? Because if the moment is gone, the future suddenly looks very uncertain. Once momentum disappears, leagues don't get to decide when it comes back. That's the part no one wants to confront. You can rebuild infrastructure. You can renegotiate contracts. You can rebrand messaging and promise change. But you cannot rewind cultural attention. The WNBA is now standing at that exact crossroads. If the 2026 season is disrupted, delayed, or canceled outright, the damage won't just be financial. It will be psychological. Fans who drifted away won't mark their calendars waiting for a return. Sponsors won't rush back out of goodwill. Networks won't gamble on momentum that already failed once. They'll move on. That's how sports works when loyalty isn't generational. When fandom isn't inherited. When interest depends on excitement instead of habit. The NBA can survive lockouts because it's embedded in culture. The WNBA doesn't have that luxury yet. It was still earning that position, and Caitlin Clark gave it the opening to do so. But openings close. The league now faces a brutal reality. It must rebuild trust with fans who felt alienated. It must stabilize financially without the illusion of leverage. And it must do all of that while knowing that the next Caitlin Clark may not arrive for decades, if ever. Stars like that aren't manufactured. They don't appear on demand. They emerge organically, and when they do, leagues either rise to the moment or expose themselves. This moment exposed everything. It exposed how thin the audience really was. It exposed how fragile the business model still is. It exposed how internal politics can derail external growth. And most of all, it exposed how quickly opportunity turns into regret when confidence outruns competence. The WNBA isn't doomed, but it's no longer protected by hype. From here on out, everything matters more. Every decision carries weight. Every misstep compounds. And every season becomes a referendum on whether the league learned anything at all from the Caitlin Clark era, or whether it simply survived it. Because the next phase won't be fueled by novelty. It will be fueled by discipline. And discipline is something this league has struggled to show when it mattered most. The real tragedy isn't that the WNBA failed. It's that it was finally given the chance not to, and didn't recognize how rare that chance was until it started slipping away. So the question now isn't about who was right or wrong in negotiations. It's simpler than that. Was this moment a foundation or a warning? So now it's your turn. Did the WNBA players push too far and kill their own momentum? Or was this collapse inevitable no matter what? And more importantly, do you honestly believe there will even be a 2026 WNBA season? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you want real, unfiltered breakdowns of basketball power plays, league politics, and the stories everyone else is afraid to touch, make sure you hit subscribe right now. Because moments like this don't come often. And when they do, you don't want to miss what really happened behind the scenes.